Helen Zille has written a book. It's called Not Without a Fight. And of course, anybody who knows Helen will know that this is a somewhat apt title. Actually, I'm curious to know, how did you arrive at this title?
Well,
Who suggested it?
it's an interesting story,
Yes.
Tim. I suppose if one person knows that that's an apt title more than you do, it's my husband.
Yes.
And of course, we were watching a television show, and at one stage, one of the characters turned to one of the other characters and said, "It's not like you to give up without a fight."
Yeah.
So my husband turned to me and said, "Oh, I could have said that to you. In fact, why don't you call your book Not Without a Fight?" And I said, "Great, good title."
Well, I know, and so I actually laughed. Now, you then joined universities, and University of Cape Town, got involved in activism in Cape Town, and the Khayelitsha story fascinates me somewhat because it was one of the big topics for people who live in Gauteng. We followed it, but we could not make sense of it. I remember the days of the Wetdoeke, and the other group was called what, Red Doeke, I think, if I recall.
It was the Witdoeke and the Comrades.
And the
mainly.
Comrades, yes.
Yeah.
And the whole mix of the taxi industry and how one group was pitted up against the other. And you were a researcher at that time, and you got to be involved. Just tell me briefly what transpired there.
Yes, it was in that very difficult period between the release of Nelson Mandela and our first election. And instead of enabling violence to decrease at that time, I don't know if you recall, Tim, but it escalated dramatically,
yes.
with people being thrown off trains, with taxi wars leading to the murder of scores and scores of people. And I was researching at the time, and I came to the conclusion that there was a deliberate attempt to fuel the violence between different opposing black groups. And that attempt was being made specifically to destabilize the ANC's attempts to re-establish itself in South Africa. And so I wrote that up and I spoke out about that.
Now, interestingly, some stories, connect you to the ANC one way or the other. But I think you would regard the ANC as your number one nemesis, or they think you are their number one enemy. Is that how it feels sometimes?
Well,
I mean, some people have even called you a racist, and I know you boil over when people say that.
Well, not anymore, because it's so meaningless.
Yeah.
I mean, not even the people who call me that believe it. So it's completely meaningless. The first time I was called a racist, I was very upset.
Yes.
But it stops having any meaning, that word, anymore, unfortunately, because it should mean something really terrible. But when people overuse it and use it when it's not appropriate, then it stops having a meaning. That's how words can be abused. I was a very strong supporter of the ANC in the 1980s, and I was involved in a lot of organizations that were aligned to the UDF and other things that were trying to see the ANC re-emerge in South Africa. So yes, I was. But in our first election, I knew that the greatest risk for the future of South Africa was that one party would become too powerful. And when that happens anywhere in the world, when one party hasn't got enough checks and balances, where there's no balance in the democracy, the one party centralizes power, has all power focused on its leader, who then does jobs for pals and cronyism, and then you get corruption, and eventually you get state capture and the criminalization of the state that we're seeing now. Now that is inevitable if there aren't enough strong independent institutions when those are captured and when there's a weak opposition. So then I knew that the next stage of the struggle for South Africa was to build a strong alternative, a non-racial principled alternative. And then I started on that project, because South Africa is more important than any political party.
But I want to touch on a couple of anecdotal stories, right, of your friendships with people like Modise and Nyami Boy in the Western Cape, how you were connected to them, if you can tell me about that. And of course, I want to talk about the Mac Maharaj story as well.
Yes. Yes. Look, Modise, who is now the Deputy Minister of International Relations, and Nyami Boy, who was the former Chief Whip of the ANC in Parliament, were both young students in COSAS, as we would say in the Western Cape. They were lighties. They were young school pupils in the Congress of South African Students. And I got to know them in the work that I was doing, in the political work that I was doing, and I got to like them very much. And as young boys are, they were always hungry and they always wanted something to eat. And when they went to have meetings, they'd come and have them at our house. And often I'd make them a big pot of food to eat. And so we got to know them very, very well. And they were with people like Leruma Kalako and Lisun Ngokoto and a whole range of people like that. Anyway, one day, Modise Squacha and Lisun Ngokoto came to me and said, no, they need to hire a car. So my husband went to Avis and hired a car for them, but we didn't know at the time that they were actually going to take people to cross the border in Lesotho. And they hired the car, I think, for 2 to 3 weeks. We hired the car and gave it to them. Although they had a driving license, we checked on that, but they went along, they didn't bring the car back, and it was the day before cell phones, and so we were looking for them all over the place. And eventually we found out that the car had been towed back to Avis in Bloemfontein because it had been found abandoned on the Lesotho border. So yes. So
And another political story of the time was it was after that. It was in the early 90s, Operation Voula, Mac Maharaj. I do remember the story very well. He was very upset, Mac, for instance, when he was arrested and had to be given special permission to go and bury his mother.
That's
and
right.
he was in chains and so on. But we did not know the backstory, the behind-the-scenes story as to how that operation got to be uncovered and how he got to be arrested. And I found that to be a very fascinating piece of information in your book. Tell me about that connect.
Well, Operation Voula was uncovered in the early years of the 1990s, and it had originally started when the ANC was allowed to return, exiles were allowed to return free into South Africa when the ANC was unbanned. And the ANC was very worried that it was a trap, it was an ambush, that they would come back and when they'd lay down their arms, the state would just round them up and put them in jail and go back to suppression again. So they wanted to ensure that they had a basis for an armed insurrection inside South Africa. So they were involved in getting a lot of arms back into South Africa, especially Chris Hani and Mac Maharaj. And no one knew anything of this, of course. And one day, the lady who worked for my parents phoned me and said my parents had just been arrested. So I tried to follow this up and found out what was going on. And eventually, to cut a long story short, it's all told in my book, I discovered that my parents, who had put down a deposit on a house for my brother to return to South Africa, had let the house out to people, and then the police had managed to follow somebody in Durban, found out the network of Operation Voula and traced it back to my brother's house here in Parkhurst. And according to the police, they found enough explosives in the basement of the house to blow up Johannesburg. And so they obviously arrested my parents because my parents had let out the house to the people who were the front people for this Operation Voula. Now, my parents didn't know about it. They just let out the house to people who seemed very nice and wanted to let a house. And this was, all, of course, going on. And that nearly brought an end to the negotiated settlement because it created such a big crisis. But we found out later that the arms were being brought in from Zambia overland in an old Bedford truck that had been converted into a safari truck for tourists. But the tourists didn't know that underneath the seats they were traveling on were huge amounts of explosives and
the
ammunition.
occupant, the tenant of the house was Mac Maharaj, was it?
The tenant of the house wasn't Mac. He was living about 2 houses away.
But he was using the place.
But he was using the place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about your family. You know, I mean, you've been active in politics for some time,
Yes.
and somehow your husband does not play a forefront role. You know, he lets you just be
That's
Helen
right.
Zille.
That's right.
You know, tell me a bit about your relationship with your husband as well as your children that allows you the space, the freedom to cause trouble and not without a fight engage in all bruising battles.
Look, my husband and I have got a very good relationship because he lets me be and I let him be. He's a very different personality from me. He likes to sit in his study and work on his books. He likes to mark theses and supervise students. That's what he likes to do. And I like to get engaged in the world.
Yes.
So he leaves me and I leave him. Sometimes he says, no, I mustn't be so tough on people and this sort of thing. And I say, well, I'm glad you're not a politician. It's better that you just stick to your
You
books.
think he would have led the DA given his personality? He wouldn't.
No, he's too sweet, man.
And your sons, what do they think of a mother who's so proactive in public life in South Africa?
I think my sons are glad that they haven't got my surname. I think they're very glad that they've got their father's surname.
Yeah.
And my sons are grown up. They're lovely boys. I love them to pieces. They're getting on with their own lives, making a contribution to South Africa. I couldn't ask for more.
But politics is, as other people say, is a dirty game. Is it?
It's not, look, politics, Tim, as you would know better than anyone else, attracts extreme characters. It attracts people who really want to make a difference to the future of South Africa and make a contribution. And it attracts opportunists who are really in it for themselves, who are really looking at the quickest shortcut to get to power so they can abuse that power to get rich. Now, really, it's those two extremes that are always doing battle with each other in the political arena. And I'm glad that a lot of people who are still idealistic, who still believe in the future of this country, will enter politics to fight off the people who are in it for their own gain.
But, it's not only one party against the other, as
Absolutely
you say, and it's
not,
also
no.
two different value systems,
Yes.
if one could call it that, extreme value systems.
Yeah.
And in your case, you've also had experience of internal battles. So when they talk about factionalism within the ANC, it doesn't surprise you. You've seen it firsthand inside your own organization.
Every party has factionalism, Tim. Every party does. And any party who says they don't is lying. But the big difference between parties is, do they have the internal systems, the institutions, the processes to work out those battles in a way that results in a fair outcome that everyone will accept? That's the big difference.
And you tried a maneuver, if I can call it that, to enhance the stature and the growth of the DA at one point, tried to recruit Dr. Ramphele, and that ended up
In tears.
in tears and a major disaster for you.
Yeah, that did. It was the biggest mistake I made in politics. She came to me and she said she was ready to join the DA. And that was in 2011 already. So it was very early on in the whole scene. And I'd been trying to recruit her for years, and I said, fantastic. We had this wonderful election result in 2011. I said, let's go. And she kept changing her mind. She'd blow hot and cold. And eventually she said, I'm ready again. And we went, and then she backed off a bit. And then she said, no, I'm definitely ready now. And we had negotiations for 6 months and put together a whole plan. And then she backed off again. And by that stage, it was too late. We were just before an election, and I had to let it go.
But you already made a big announcement that
Correct.
she's going to be one
Correct.
of your key people.
Because she insisted on having that press conference right then and there.
Yeah, and you had a long relationship with her, as a
Yeah.
friend and so forth. Was it?
It was very
one-
heartbreaking,
Was
Tim.
it one of the worst political experiences for you?
Yes, it was one of my worst experiences, actually, not just worst political experiences.
Very disappointed.
Yeah,
about
because
it.
this isn't just a political relationship, it's a very long friendship.
Yes. Being a leader of an organization such as the DA, and you've done your best to grow the party, but you've met with a whole number of challenges along the way, and of course, you've achieved some successes.
Yes, Tim, I have. And as the leader of an organization, you find it in a particular situation. You try to assess what that situation is. You establish a vision as to where you want to take that organization, and then you do your best to get it there. And you hope that you leave it in a better condition than you found it. That's all you can do.
Are there any political adversaries that you hold in high regard and others that you think are the worst characters you've ever come across? If you can mention them by name,
Well, I
after all,
mentioned
you
them in the
would.
book.
Yeah.
I mentioned in the book. Look, I don't want to get a hierarchy
Yes.
of rogues or
Yes.
a hierarchy of heroes. But I've got a lot of heroes, actually,
Yes.
inside South Africa and outside South Africa. I still think that Desmond Tutu is an incredible voice of courage and commitment. I think what Provin's going through now is very, very difficult for him and very trying. And of course, internationally, I have a very high regard for Angela Merkel, who is a wonderful, brave, courageous, intelligent leader.
One of your critics said, after going through the book, says, you don't say enough about economic empowerment or black economic empowerment or restorative approach to healing South Africa and helping advance reconciliation, that you are reticent about it. Is it true?
Well, if you read my last chapter, it's all about that. And I think it's the best chapter in the book, chapter 23. I look at how we are going to get restoration happening sustainably and well and permanently in South Africa. So I take it very seriously. The battle for the future of South Africa is economic freedom. And the choice for economic freedom in South Africa is between blue and red. Blue and red. The DA and the EFF both have a vision for economic freedom. You have to look throughout history at what the EFF's policies have led to: total economic destruction and serfdom. And the only strategies that have managed to take millions of people out of poverty are the policies that the DA proposes for South Africa.
Musi Maimane, good successor, or
Great
could have
leader.
been an improvement?
Great leader. Great improvement on me. Wonderful vision, real integrity, commitment to non-racialism and constitutionalism. Perfect.
Julius Malema, Jacob Zuma.
Julius Malema calls me Gogo. He's a very charismatic leader, but time will tell whether he can build a strong internal organization that holds together through difficult times.
And the president, Zuma?
He's a very charming person individually, and you'll see in my book, he tried to teach me how to dance and all sorts of other things happened there. So I have a very good personal relationship with Jacob Zuma, but I have to fight him with all I've got because he's taking South Africa in the wrong direction.
You've published a book. I said to you earlier, I think you want to step down. That people who normally write books, biographies like you have, do so because they believe the time has come for them to make a change.
Well, I do have to make a change in 2.5 years. My term as Premier of the Western Cape comes to an end. So that'll be 2 terms if I get there. You never know what's going to happen in politics from one day to the next term. But then it'll be a new frontier for me. I've got a lot of energy as I sit here now, fortunately. I feel I have got a long road to hoe, and I want to be involved in the struggle for a fair and just South Africa for as long as I live.
Helen Zille, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much, Tim. It was lovely to see you.
Not without a fight. That in itself defines the life struggle of Helen Zille. And the book is very, very interesting. There's a lot of personal stuff in there. I did not even touch on it because that is, you need to have your own moment, in the privacy of your time, reading the book to discover what happened when Helen Zille grew up as a young woman to where she is today.